what philosophy is in the Christian context, namely the handmaid to theology, an entirely independent standing discipline, but one which, in a Christian context, is ordered to the same thing that theology is, namely to bring us into greater knowledge of God through knowing the world that He has created. And so philosophy, like theology, orders us to God and helps us to attain happiness.
Thank you, Justin, for your introduction. Indeed, I hope today to break open Laudato Si and its potential for even more dialogue that we have embarked upon. A couple of things I want to say up front. Both the talks given by Tony and Gabriel, thank you so much. You are a hard act to follow, but I tried to bring pictures. And I know that my talk and Father Chris's talk stand in between wonderful spiritual food and intellectual food that you got this morning and lunch. So maybe we're the appetizers. What I'd like to unfold today is looking at Laudato Si as something that I call a deep theological ethic. Laudato Si, if I can just get this a little bit, or maybe, can I take this off?
Sure.
Okay. Laudato Si as a deep theological ethic. What do I mean by that? And what do we mean by deep? What do we mean by a theological ethic? What are the integral approaches and methodological commitments I see in this theological ethic? And how do these methodological commitments extend to other areas of concern? Moreover, challenging current ways we make personal, social, economic, and political decisions, suggesting, as we heard this morning, a virtue-based ethical approach, an integral vision. Together, we will commit ourselves to this challenge, as we heard this morning, and as we hear Pope Francis tell us, one world and one common plan. I begin with this picture of our Earth from the moonshot, and I believe that this is really the place where Francis also wishes to begin. The first lines of Laudato Si I take extremely seriously. They're not a preface, they're a stance. Laudato Si, mi Señor, praise be to you, my Lord. In choosing this particular prayer of St. Francis, he is drawing from his spirituality, from the awe that is in Francis's spirituality. He's in this awe that helps us to become capable of care for our common home. We are called to open to the wonder, not only the destruction with which we view our cosmos, but also its beauty. And as we heard from Gabriel this morning, to maybe think about other language, reverence, mystery, affection, compassion. It is a shift that keeps us centered on God's gift of creation as we realize we have a responsibility to care for our common home. From an anthropocentric pragmatism to a solidaristic, integral, ethical focus that is the dynamism of the entire document. It reminds us that we are pilgrims, as Indian author Satish Kumar reminds us. We are pilgrims on earth. Indeed, the entire universe is imbued with the divine, full of wonder and mystery and permeated through and through with spirit. Tourists view the earth and its riches, or even existence, as a font of goods and a service to the humans, and more specifically to human pleasure. Value for tourists on this planet is usefulness. Value for pilgrims is the way all existence pulls us towards God, helps us to see that we are all gravitating towards God. As Desjardins has said, quote, "One could say that the whole of life lies in seeing. The history of the living world can be reduced to the elaboration of even more perfect eyes." So in the opening pages of Laudato Si, Francis is asking us to embrace this vision. And this vision is deep. It's an integral vision. Deep, I use the word deep, comes from the technologies and the scientific understanding of a deep ecology. It is a system thinking's approach, recognizing the existence of sets of relationships that bring any reality into being and contribute to life-sustaining movements, to actions. It is not about competing entities, as Martin Nowak, a fellow of DSPT, has shown us, but about super cooperators. Cooperation being the engine of evolution. Keeping complexity in the forefront, integral ecology, integral development, integral liberation, all refer to a broad-based and complex way of understanding our realities. Thus, to speak of a deep ecology ethically and spiritually means recognizing possibilities for a holistic approach to facing problems, bringing together thinking, feeling, spirituality, and action. It involves moving beyond the individualism to seeing ourselves as persons of interdependent relationships with God, one another, and all creation. Ecology is not just seen as something out there, but something we are a part of and have a responsibility in its care. In the Bolivia talk that I believe Gabriel mentioned or Anthony mentioned, Pope Francis talked about illiteracy, and he called it alfabetizione integradora, a literacy of integration, learning the ways of integrating, seeing things as a true whole, and that is liberation. That is freedom. He calls it a joy, a peace. He also calls for a sense of sobriety in our living present existence in order for us to embrace this true liberation. So it's a certain humility. And moreover, he says in chapter 6, it's a Trinitarian reality. It's a way of relating that images the Trinity and its complement of relationships. What this means then is that the theological ethic is coming from this notion of the Trinity, an attentiveness and a consciousness. It's a sacramental vision of relationships that informs the theological ethic. Common, integrating good is not constructed, but revealed and offered as a principle of human relating, interdependence, true freedom, liberation, and authentic flourishing. It calls for a conversion to such consciousness. It is a serene attentiveness, Francis reminds us, a capacity to be fully present to someone, some reality, without thinking of what comes next, which accepts each moment as a gift from God to be lived to the full. An inner peace that helps us to overcome the unhealthy anxiety which makes us superficial, aggressive, compulsive consumers, he says, end of quote. It is knowing the right goals and our capacity to live according to the direction to which God the Creator draws us. Theological ethics, as we see in Aquinas, is based on these kinds of ideas of beatitude, the exitus, the reditus, and the important keys that are a part of our recognition of this movement towards God. We know that Aquinas composes an ethics in light of understanding of God and God's relationship to the world. Everything proceeds and returns from God. Moral norms are grounded in the moral ordering of a creaturely nature. All are ordered to their ends as God has created them. Human beings are related to God in this ordering of nature. It's a virtue ethics, not a divine command ethics. It's focused on human flourishing as we move towards God. We gravitate towards God through longings, desires, knowledge, and a regular examine and renewal of our behaviors and actions. Who are we becoming by these decisions that we are making? It is an ethics that, it is an ethics that's a movement of the reasoning creature into the divine mystery. So it's systematic. As I mentioned, it considers the human being as a moral agent with goals, capacities, emotions, disposition, which when integrated with law and grace move them towards perfect happiness, beatitude. It's rooted in our nature. Human beings have a natural desire for the vision of God, which they are incapable of filling on their own without grace. It is the, if you wish, a dialogue between the providence and the prudence. God has provided for all creatures, for all creation, an existence. This existence is good. And it's also found, the goodness is unfolded as we see as we are moving in order towards our end. So discernment, discretion are critical to the realization of our life of happiness. And as I said earlier, it is that we are made in God's image. God is exemplar, a certain analogy or proportion as we are creatures created by God who seek to know and love God. We image the processions of the Word and the Spirit within the triune Godhead in our acts of understanding and of loving, and in particular of our knowing and loving of God. One significant meditation that I would recommend for you is to look at the chapter 6 of Laudato Si, and particularly to look at paragraphs 238 to 240, and meditate on those, because that's the, I would say, penetrating vision that he has within it. So the deep theological ethic is about the creation of a world. It's discovered by our contemplating the immense bounty of God, who wills to share divine goodness. We participate in God's beatitude by knowledge and love, anticipating here and now what will be fulfilled in eternity. It is the ultimate fulfillment of our human heart. It is a beatitude which motivates the moral life. It is a freedom for excellence. It is a beatitude that takes responsibility with all creation to bring it to fulfillment as God has ordained. So this theological ethic then, Francis reminds us that is a shift in habits and actions and attitudes. We must witness to the true nature of all things, that we are beings capable of intervening positively through virtuous behavior and avoiding culpable ignorance. Throughout the introduction, in the introduction and throughout the encyclical, reminds us that we are called to this freedom for excellence, our common home. In this theological ethic, we realize the fullness of life to which all creatures are called, and the conversion that's necessary, that we might realize the potential of being pilgrims and not simply tourists on this earth. So again, the common good is not constructed or a resource discovered, but actually revealed, so that we might welcome it, promote it, protect it, and so to grow it. This is human relating, interdependence, liberty, and authentic, holistic flourishing. Francis also talks about education for the covenant in the last sections of chapter 6, and he's unfolding this vision for us to find ourselves moving towards. He calls it ecological citizenship in paragraph 209. A selfless ecological commitment, he calls us to. And there are several points that he raises about this, that we must be aware of the gravity of today's cultural and ecological crisis, and in such a way that it translates into new habits, motivates us for change. We must build on the momentum we see in young people who have a new ecological sensitivity and generous spirit. We need to develop good sense that is not afraid to critique the myths about modernity and capable of grasping the salient features of a complex situation as we seek to engage in resourceful and responsive decision-making. And then he calls us all, each one of us, to be educators capable of developing the ethics of ecology and helping people through effective pedagogy to, quote, grow in solidarity, responsibility, and compassionate care. And he believes that this education takes place in various settings, and that each of us, whether we realize it or not, are planting the seeds towards this education or not. So, selfless love, creative power, faithful presence, demanding holiness. His theological ethic helps us to realize that we, all creatures, are a servant of a vision larger than ourselves. Francis's approach reminds me, and I mentioned this in the article that is in Listening magazine, reminds me very much of the approach of Alan Watkins and Ken Wilber in looking at wicked problems. In looking at wicked problems, they recognize the multi-dimensions of all the problems, any problem that we were looking at in our society. But Wilber and Watkins also recognize that at the heart of this problem is the human decision, the humanity. How do we see ourselves in the world? How do we see ourselves with one another? The interdependence of relationships and the interdependence of vision. They talk about an integral frame mapping, which assumes an epistemology that engages in all types of knowledge, scientific, economic, philosophical, and sociological, as well as various perspectives emerging from grassroots, cultural, political, etc., into these deliberative processes. The goal of this kind of integral frame mapping is coherence, an integrity with which we act that respects the totality of the situation. I believe Francis, not only in his theological ethic, but also in his approach, is really building upon this kind of integral vision and this realization that is coming from not only the religious world, the theological world, but also from the various different disciplines. It's an interdisciplinary commitment. And if there was one way to kind of, if I was to redo the table of contents of Laudato Si, not that I need to, it flows nicely, paragraph 16. Paragraph 16 is the commitment to this integral approach. He says, although each chapter will have its own subject and specific approach, it will also take up and re-examine important questions previously dealt with. Notice the methodologies there. This is particularly the case with a number of themes, which will reappear as the encyclical unfolds. Number of themes as the encyclical unfolds. Maybe from even what I've said thus far, you're seeing a number of themes as our talks this morning evolve. As examples, I will point to the intimate relationship between the poor and the fragility of our planet. And when we think of some of the statistics that Tony shared with us this morning, you realize the critical vision that that brings us to the decision-making process. And he says he will critique paradigms, forms of power. He calls us to seek other ways of understanding the economy and progress. And he asks us to be forthright and honest in these assessments, forthright and honest. And he says, I'm going to challenge you from moving from a throwaway culture to a new lifestyle. And he says these questions will not be dealt with once and for all, but reframed and enriched again and again. And it's amazing. We were saying during the break how many of us have been called to talk about Laudato Si in various circles. It's constantly, it's a reservoir, it's a wellspring of ideas that constantly come up. And Francis is trying to remind us that this is a conversation starter. He really, I believe, looks at the problem similar to what I mentioned in terms of Watkins and Wilber, but I really believe that Francis's approach is more polyhedric, the polyhedron that you see there. And he's contrasting this vision of reality to the kind of globalization of a technocratic paradigm, which can kind of flatten things out. Because when we think of the polyhedra approach, it means it's a solid figure, fits together, it has various planes, surfaces, and each of those planes and surfaces are interactive. And so he wants to kind of approach it with this kind of multi-dimension, a network, if you will, of commitments, because it's true that the polyhedra can also be a prism, so a way of our being able to see things. I think there are three particular methodological commitments. He's committed in the encyclical, and he asks us to commit ourselves as we look for solutions to inductive processes, to something that David Hollenbach calls a dialogic universalism, and to epistemic subsidiarity. Let me go through those a little bit. So inductive processes. I think you see within Laudato Si, as even our speakers have mentioned, that he is very much reading the signs of the times. And he is very much like we see in the Vatican II whole approach, the idea of what is happening in our world. I mean, the very first line of our apostolic exhortation Constitution says the joys and hopes and fears and griefs of the people of this age, or the joys and hopes and griefs and fears of the people of Jesus Christ, the church, of Jesus Christ and his church. Well, how do we know that? It's because we're listening. How do we know that? It's because we're engaged, we're reading the signs of the times. And so it's very much tied into the pastoral circle or the pastoral spiral. And you can see that in the encyclical, where he's tapping on our experience. He's offering us analysis, and the analysis is not just an analysis of the human roots of the ecological crisis, but an analysis that also engages us with the reflection, the gospel of creation. It's very similar to the approach, too, that we see, and then the analysis results in a new vision. And for Francis, that new vision he articulates in chapter 4. He calls it an integral ecology. And that's the new place, the new vision. And then there's the action plan. And actually, he gives us a form of action plans by inviting us to create lines of approach, areas of dialogue, and education being formed for this new ecology. He points to where there are all ways that you and I can act concretely in developing the lines of approach and this education that is needed. It very much also ties into, as was said earlier, Paul VI, Popular and Progressio, who also looked at the idea of development and recognized the importance of integral holistic development, as was also mentioned before. Recall that Paul VI, I think it was paragraph 64, called the world sick. But he ended with the idea that we could co-create something together. And in fact, he said that development was the new word for peace in that particular document. In the article that I wrote in Listening Magazine, I likened Francis's process also to the spiritual exercises. Being a good Jesuit, not me, Francis, I'm a Holy Cross sister. I see that he's also bringing us along with the meditations as you would. And really the first principle and foundation is that first part of the encyclical. That first principle and foundation, even before you get to, well, what's happening in our world, that is very much part of the spiritual exercises tradition. You don't go on into the purgative and illuminative stages unless you can be grounded in awe, grounded in that you were created and that creation is good. And so this is what's happening in the spiritual exercises. And by the time we get to chapter 3, he's asking us, you got a choice to make. Either the technocratic paradigm or the integral ecology paradigm. Which one? And of course, he opens up to us the possibility of choosing this integral ecology, a holistic vision of the cosmos and its relationship with God. He calls us to examine this. Now here's another principle that I think comes out of his good Jesuit training, and that is every part of the encyclical, you can kind of pause at the end of each of the chapter and you can make a consciousness examine out of that chapter. And look at it and say, where is God in this? Where am I? And hopefully that produces for us an evolutionary consciousness, something that Gabriel mentioned, expanding horizons and interests. What does evolutionary consciousness consist of? I have just 4 things that I think are very important. Have a beginner's mind. Enter into the wells of listening so that you can expand horizons and interests. Approach everything with a firm resolve to transform. We can persuade and we can educate our desires. Isn't this true of consciousness examined? You enter it with a resolve to change. And recall, and this is very important for dialogue, recall that you, all creation, and all of us have evolving edges. We are continually growing. Now, again, to emphasize, as we saw in Tony's opening remarks, Francis is using these inductive processes, and he's very much building on the encyclical tradition. You know, the whole idea of a circular letter, being a catalyst for change, drawing attention to the kinds of things that we have to look at. Even though every pope might not have used inductive processes in preparing their particular encyclicals, it certainly calls us to look at the local situation and what we might do locally and globally. The other thing that we see is that in the Catholic social teaching, we recognize that most important is that we are witnesses to something larger. We are witnesses to an authentic flourishing. And in that, we teach about the importance of making choices towards this authentic flourishing. And the other part of the inductive processes that we see in Laudato Si is that it will call us to a contextual discernment, global decision-making, recognizing that the decisions I make here locally have an effect globally. And it's an invitation to look at that. It's a commitment that decisions cannot be imposed from outsiders, but must involve the people who are affected. It is essential that we create the forums to take in the views of those who will live in these areas. How many of us have asked the poor what they think of this encyclical? Francis would ask us to ask that. So local communities and social institutions have been undone by economic exploitation. They must be engaged in solutions and interventions which cannot be opposed from these outside forces, but with also openness to special care towards indigenous communities, he says. And this brings us to the second commitment that I think he makes, is something that David Hollenbach calls the dialogic universalism. In paragraph 61, he says, in paragraph 61, you see that his claim to a theological ethic does not mean that only theologians of a certain religion or even religions are worthy dialogue partners. Social problems addressed in community are a community of networks. But we have a certain confidence, as David Hollenbach would say, where he calls it a universalism, that we share a certain general characteristic as human beings, as creatures. And yet there are differences, thus we need dialogue in order to realize the common ground. And in this realization, we know it's slow, it's incremental, and it really depends on deep encounters and honest intellectual exchange. So it's a kind of openness and intellectual hospitality that is appreciating insights from within the community and from around the world. One of the encyclicals that I think really sparks this dialogue, it was the first encyclical written by Paul VI, Ecclesiam Suam. Paul VI wrote this in August of 1964, right after John XXIII had died. And in that encyclical, he basically was trying to, I think, push the Vatican Council. The Vatican Council was going to meet in that fall. And he talked about the importance of dialogue. In fact, it was the first time that the word dialogue was ever used in an encyclical. And he talked about three characteristics that make up Christ's church. We're self-aware, we're open to renewal, and we're also engaged in dialogue. And the dialogue that Paul VI recommended were 4 critical dialogues. Catholics have to talk to other Catholics. Christians have to talk together. All religions have to talk together. And all of society, all the people who make up our society need to be engaged in dialogue. The genius of the document for Paul was, if you miss any one of those dialogues, not a one will be effective. So the idea of all of these dialogues coming together. So I think when Francis is talking about an ecological conversion, he's hoping that we kind of bring that for each other through honest debate, respecting divergent views, recognizing that the synonym for dialogue is learning, and being known as a church that doesn't stop the conversation, but one that starts the conversation. You see this clearly in chapter 5, where he says lines of approach and action. He adds complexity in his titles. Dialogue and environment in the international community. Dialogue for new national and local policies. Dialogue and transparency in decision making. Politics and economy in dialogue for human fulfillment. Religions in dialogue with science. I think Francis is thinking too that these dialogues are not just effective ways to make a decision, but they're forming us. They're forming us in habits of deliberation. Scott Aiken and Caleb Clayton talk about group deliberative virtues that are needed in our world today, and really that a good citizen, we would say, a disciple of Christ, might be a person who is a good deliberator. So we have deliberate wit, deliberate friendliness, deliberate temperance, courage, humility. We are able to creatively, mutually enter into each other's reality and to dialogue with that. And this comes to my last point that I think is important in terms of the commitments and methodology, and that is to epistemic subsidiarity. What I mean by that is he's really asking us to be a community of decision makers, of good deliberators. Munus in the sense of a gift, and cum coming together. Each of us brings something to the situation, the subsidium. What each has is in his or her own right, capacity, and knowledge comes forward and is exercised. And this becomes the wisdom with which we can create a good decision-making, holistic decision-making. Francis is also committed to the fact that the context from which each of us brings the subsidium is important in the decision-making as well. In fact, as I mentioned earlier, linking the plight of the poor with the ecological crisis is not only talking about those who might suffer the most, but letting the poor educate us. Thus, the pedagogical goal is contributive, collaborative learning. It is a holistic learning, emotional, intelligent, cognitive, and relational, capable of forming habits, that is, lines of approach across disciplines, regions, cultures, even time. Francis asks us, think of the generations that are not here, the generations that will come after you. So, moreover, such intellectual hospitality reveals that we are companions in meaning-making, hermeneutical companions of our existence, helping us to understand the depths of the integral vision for all of creation's flourishing. So, how do we renew the covenant? In these last few slides, I just want to talk about the idea of how Laudato Si has been responded to by theologians and also a particular religious group, and also how do I see Laudato Si in its thinking having an effect on other writings and thinkings of Francis. So there have been various responses to Laudato Si from the theological circle, and I know Dan and others are going to talk about Laudato Si in terms of being received here in the United States. But theologian John Cobb has created a book shortly after Laudato Si called For Our Common Home. And in this approach, he's looking at process-relational responses to Laudato Si. In other words, he grabs theologians and social ethicists and he says, what are you going to do with Laudato Si? And then they write a chapter about how they might engage Laudato Si in their own theological and social thinking. Also, there is a text written by Sean McDonough that contextualizes Laudato Si in the Catholic teachings on the environment, so giving it a long look. How does this particular text draw from all that the Church has said about the environment? In 2016, Theological Studies did a special edition calling different theologians into the process of thinking about theologically Laudato Si. And we had our own conference in listening where it was an experiment, where we brought an evolutionary biologist to challenge us. We don't normally talk to evolutionary biologists as theologians. We read their material, but face-to-face in conversation, and he basically broke open to us the new dimensions, the Anthropocene, and basically said, theologians, what are you going to do about it? So that was a really kind of a, it's almost like the Francis effect in our moral thinking and our theology. It's there. Another impact was the Islamic declaration, and Father Dominic has some sheets that I wanted to pass out to you. I don't want to read the whole declaration, but I thought you would be really intrigued, and we have copies for everybody, of the document itself. It's not, as Father Thomas Arrow has said, it's not as long as Laudato Si. It's a very short document. But what I like about it is that it really is taking those threads and approaches in terms of Laudato Si. I'll let you read and see that, and I also put a link, and I also was told I have 5 minutes, put a link on the paper so you could follow it. One of the things that the document brings out, just in general, is this idea of harmony. There is a concept in Islam called ihsan, and that concept is called beauty. It's the idea of doing all things as if you see God, and if not, no God sees you. And that the entire Islamic life is about ihsan, the unfolding vision of God. And that Muslims seek to stay on the straight path, as-sirat al-mustaqim, so that they can be a part of this unfolding. Just a couple of pieces, because I only have a few minutes. First of all, I think that this thinking that I have laid out, these methodological commitments, you see definitely in all of his documents that have to do with migrants, refugees, and the human traffic. Look at his peace statement, the contemplative gaze. That's the preamble of the encyclical. That's chapter 2 of the encyclical. The literacy of interconnection. He says, this is what the literacy looks like. We're one family, growing in solidarity, or not. We are sharing our gifts, revealing the common good, or not. And the or not, he sets up mileposts for action. Are we welcoming people? Are we protecting people? Are we promoting people? Are we integrating people? And ultimately, and I'll end on this, though it's hard to end. Wait, I have one more slide to end on. I make a claim that this is Francis's peace document. He may make a document about nonviolence, because that's such a nonviolence and ending the notion of just war theory, maybe thinking of just antebellum and just postbellum. We may not have a criteria for just war. So very much in the spirit of Pacem in Terris, looking at the interdependence of rights and the awarding of those rights and the realization of those rights and act of solidarity. This is his peace document. And I feel that in this way, he's helping us to look at a comprehensive, sustainable, strategic, and infrastructure conversion. Ultimately, what we're doing here today is what Francis is calling us to. This collegio, he just said this statement a few days ago in Chile. And he called on the importance of Catholic universities, the importance of all of us here today gathered, that we have a prophetic role to play by discovering spaces for dialogue, encountering paths of friendly disagreement, respectful differences, but advance us as a community towards a renewed national, international, and global coexistence. So, it's a deep theological ethics that he invites each of us to participate in. Thank you so much.